Okay, hi guys. So we're going to just do a brief discussion about the waterfall and the agile model, and we're going to see like how some of the commonly used terms that we do in waterfall and the agile plays out in a real life scenario in projects. I've already done a video on how agile and waterfall, uh, compares in terms of how the work is done, how the tasks are broken up, how the planning is done, etc. This video is more focused on comparison of some of the benefits of each of these processes and who scores on whom in uh, you know in a typical project, right? So one of the things that I've noticed in waterfall and agile is that waterfall is very much of a document oriented process. Okay, so what I mean by a document oriented process is that um, in this a lot of the milestones or a lot of the so-called client touch points are based on documents, right? So which means that everything that you're doing as an implementation team or everything that has been done as a business team is captured in documents. They're signed off. These documents are pretty heavy. These are pretty extensive. It captures all scenarios, everything, right? So these documentations, if you come across a BRD, I will try to attach a BRD sample if I get hold of one. But the point is, it's pretty extensive. It's pretty voluminous. It's got a lot of um, written stuff in it, right? And what that means is that a waterfall model emphasizes a lot on documentation, right? Because if you think about the waterfall model's entire workflow, right, the process, what happens is that you finish one piece of work and then only you move on to the other piece, right? So now the importance of documentation comes in this kind of a structure because for anything to start, right, anything for let's say step two to start, you need a very detailed documentation of what needs to happen in step two. Otherwise, the documentation is not clear, concise, and agreed upon by all team members, right? And it's very important that this documentations have to be signed off by all the stakeholders, everyone who's working on the project. If these documents don't comply to everyone's standards, then the teams will not be able to go. And as a result, what happens is these documentations are very important. Unless you get these documentations signed off, it's very difficult to start or kind of keep things moving. Okay, so a lot of emphasis on the documents. Compared to that, agile I have seen is very feature oriented. What it means is that agile is basically saying that you don't need to focus that much on documentation. Don't go into extensive documentation. Don't get into like writing lines and lines of what should happen here and what should happen there, but make some basic assumptions, but also make it clear and concise. Get the critical features, critical aspects of the features noted down. In Agile, basically, you will come across this thing called user stories. So capture these in user stories. These user stories will contain your business requirements or business rules, which is called the PR, or also sometimes it's called acceptance criteria. But this acceptance criteria is not even close in terms of the volume and scenarios that a business requirement document or a TRD or a technical requirement document captures. Right, so these are much simpler, much more like feature oriented, much more end user oriented kind of statement. Just to give you an example, let's say you are developing a button. Okay, so you're developing a button, and let's say that button says sign in. So a typical user story for that sign in will be if I click on this button, I should be able to sign into so and so page. I should be able to sign into a newsletter and so forth. But in a BRD TRD diagram, what will happen is you will have a lot of elements over here, right? So it should, I mean, the documentation itself will contain the front end logic that should go in, the color coding, the text, the font, everything, the back end logic of it, everything, right? So all the details of the entire implementation, right? So it's almost uh, at the document level only we are doing the entire brainstorming. We are almost finalizing as many things as possible, right? And keeping very few things as variable. Whereas in Agile, what we're saying is that don't make the documentation so strict. Don't make it like that you have to capture everything, you have to fix everything, right? Keep things moving. But instead, what you do is instead of spending so much time on documentation, finish the documentation as soon as possible. Get the team to work on the documentation or get the team to work on the requirement. Build a feature, right? And again, Agile is like very, very feature oriented. What it says, build a feature, build a baseline version, build a what sometimes is called a prototype. Okay, do a small proof of concept of the feature, and run it across the client and get the buy-in on whatever you have built, right? So you don't need to document it and show it to the client in a PowerPoint or a Word document. But instead, what you do is you use your developer tools, right? You use your team's faculty, build something, uh, and make it as close to the final version that needs to go out, and then show the client, do a demo, right, on the client. And demos are an important integral part of an agile sprint. So do the demos with the client, get their buy-in, right, and then build on top of that, which is basically what Agile says. It's an incremental kind of a process, right? So what it means is that it says that build a small feature, run it across the client, capture the feedback, and then build on top of it. If the client is happy with it, go as is. If the client wants something to be changed, change. But don't spend so much time on documentation. Rather build, or rather make small use cases, user stories, get them signed off from the client, and then move on to the next. Okay. In this aspect, I would say that, to be honest, I find that Agile is obviously much better in terms of a software project, because in softwares, I have seen if it's a non-technical client, then there is always a risk that when you document something, the client might just say yes, and they might agree to certain features, certain things that you want to do from the implementation side, but they often don't understand what exactly they're signing up for, right? It's much better if you can actually get that captured in a feature, if you can actually show them on a demonstration basis what you have done, and then get their buy-in on that. That makes much more sense. The client is also much more comfortable, and you can also get a better feedback from the client, right? So, but then there are also use cases where documentations are important if the client is a very regulatory kind of a client, which has very strict guidelines. It's a healthcare client, right? So it's got very strict guidelines according to certain things that they need to be built. So with their documentations work very strictly. You can't move away from that. You can't say that, okay, I'm not going to follow the documentation, the guidelines. Those guidelines need to be followed. Um, Documentation does become important, but it doesn't mean again that waterfall model doesn't have demos or agile doesn't have documentation. They do exist in each of the cycles, but what I'm saying is that agile has a much higher priority given to features rather than documentations, right? Whereas on waterfall model, it is much more imperative that you capture everything in the documentation level and then you start working. And that is because of the inherent nature of how each of these models work. Whereas waterfall model works on much larger cycles with much larger pieces of work which is delivered by the team in each delivery. Agile is much smaller, much more flexible, right? So that is why it's much easier to get the client interventions and get the client buy-ins at a smaller interval. Okay. Um, so basically, if we move on to the next point now, right? So um, as this waterfall and agile feature as part of the nature of the structuring of these things, uh, agile I think has got an advantage when it comes to the prioritization and planning part. Okay? Why I would say is, sorry, let me just go back. Prioritization. So I would say Agile scores much higher in prioritization class planning. And the reason is because if you see, right, so Agile's work pieces are much smaller. It's like small chunks of work as opposed to waterfall model where you're doing like much larger pieces of chunks of work. Now the thing is, like, just imagine like one of the scenarios could be that there is one developer who is working over here in this particular piece of work, right? Now you suddenly realize that you need help in this chunk and you don't need a developer on this chunk. Now to move this developer from here to here itself, because it's a much larger chunk, is going to take you a little bit, at least a little bit more time, because this is a much bigger module, right? So obviously the implementation is much complicated in this scenarios because it's a much bigger module which requires a lot of different scenarios which needs to be understood. So basically, what will happen is to get this resource, this developer, basically to you know um, onboarded to upskill to train that person will be much higher. Whereas if it's a smaller module, right, because you have got like much smaller chunks, what happens, it's easy to reallocate people. Okay? You can always move people around because this chunks is smaller. It's not like as if the work is like huge. The upskill time will be of course much less, right? Another very important feature is that because the chunks over here are much smaller, right? In user stories, it's much smaller. So what happens is, it's a very common use case where somewhere in the middle of the sprint, and this is more about my third point, but also important in this part is that sometimes what happens in the middle of the sprint, you realize that the business comes up and says that we need to stop working on whatever we're working and prioritize something else, right? And this has happened a lot, right? So if, let's say, an example of, you're doing some government implementation, right? You're implementing a government website. The government says that we have announced that we're going to do a flood emergency announcement with the PM, and that is a feature that needs to go in immediately, right? With all the donation features, people should come and give us money and everything. Now, it's a priority feature, right? So basically, what they're saying is that now we need this to be hands-on to be done. Okay. So what happens in these kind of smaller modules is it's much easier for the development team to abandon a smaller module. Worst case scenario, even if let's say that they delete the entire code base of the smaller module that worked, even then they're losing much smaller work, right? So basically what it means is that it's much lighter for teams to offboard and onboard from one piece of work to the other, right? Whereas over here, moving from one chunk to the other, to move the team from doing something and to move them to doing something else is much, much costlier, and it makes it much difficult for the team to move across, right? Also, it's much more difficult if we'll come to the discussion later on where we talk about moving items across, right? What becomes important, what becomes not. How do we prioritize items, right? So even in terms of timelines, right? Because now you have smaller units of work, right? So still, what happens is even if you are getting some new feature to be developed, and let's say the entire team is working on a new feature, okay, it becomes your priority feature. What happens is because you have like smaller pieces of work here, there is a possibility that because the units are much smaller, the product owner or whoever is like going to prioritize the work, who's going to plan it, can kind of think, okay, so these are smaller works. The visibility is much higher. Okay? So, I mean, higher in the sense it's much more granular. So, what happens is in case I need to reshuffle, in case I need to move around these blocks later in the sprint or in any time period, basically it becomes easier for me to move this around because again, these are small chunks of work. Okay. So basically, it comes to the point that because the units of work in Agile is much smaller than that of Waterfall, it's much easier to move them around. And we should keep that in mind. So in prioritization planning, flexibility is much higher on the Agile basis. Um, in Waterfall, again, this is going back to the point one. This prioritization planning is a little bit difficult because Waterfall is a little bit more documentation heavy. As I said, it is a bit more sequence heavy, right? So it makes a point that not too many movements are done once people have started working, which works well in a lot of scenarios. It's an advantage for a lot of people who don't like to change things around. Once you have done something, you want to do something with full focus, that is fine. But in cases where you need to reprioritize, replan a lot, Agile again becomes a much, much more viable option. And then the final thing I would say, which is kind of, I would say Agile's almost its slogan. It says that Agile helps you to fail faster. Okay. Which means that since Agile again is like having much more client interaction, right? So basically, what is happening is if you're doing the same piece of work in Agile, it takes you like four client interactions, right? The client intervenes and 4 points. Like the client demo happens four times. The same thing for Waterfall might happen once. So basically, what that means is that I get to capture my client's feedback at a very early stage, right? Because I'm doing small incremental feature demonstrations. We are showing the client the baseline structures. If the client says that we're not doing well, then that also gets captured much faster, right? So basically, what happens is it helps the entire planning team or the entire management team to understand how the project is performing. Okay. Now, it doesn't mean that if your project you're doing in Agile, if you are not doing well, if your workers are not working well, if you as a manager is not managing well, doesn't mean that Agile automatically magically changes everything. But what it means is that it gives you a clear picture of where the thing is going. It's like an indicator which comes up very fast, saying that hey, you're not doing great in this particular piece of work. So try to either change, see what happens, like diagnose. Maybe it's because of something which you can solve very easily. There are plenty of tools in Agile. We'll talk about Agile tools later on. We'll talk about how stories are written, how Jira and MSVSTS can be used to see these dashboards. But for the timing, what you need to understand is that Agile helps you understand where you stand in terms of development and progress much faster because the client is coming in at a much faster rate than in the waterfall process. The client comes in at almost like second or third day of your development. You all automatically get a head start and understand where you're going with it, right? It also helps you understand the client's impulse, right? what the client will be happy with, what the client will not be happy with, right? So it basically engages the client much more and thus makes the development much more user centric rather than basically process centric or tech centric. Okay, and one another point I would say, which is not kind of, I would say, officially a very good point, but still I would like to make an scene. This is about the billing. Okay, now what I've seen is that in agile, like there are, I mean, if you think about billing, right? So there are like two or three types of billing, right? T&M, fixed price, and then you've got your milestone, right? Now, fixed price is completely like, I think, something which we can omit out of the discussion, because basically fixed price says that I give you the money, you do me the work. Okay, I don't care like how you do it. You get more people, less people, but you do it by yourself. So we're not going to talk about fixed price, but the time and money and the milestone model, right, that we have. I feel that in time and money, first of all, agile scores higher, because the thing is that in agile, again, since your pieces of work are small, right? So, and it's much more flexible. You can move around people. This entire thing is much more, user centric, as I said. Right, so it's much easier for me to actually move my resources around. So what happens? Let's take a scenario, right? So when you're doing some piece of development, and this is specific to software development again, let's say you're building a feature, right? If you build a feature, uh, now that feature might have like design, right? And then you have development, then you have QA. Okay, let's say there are three tasks that you perform. Now, in a waterfall model, it has to be like design first. Only when design gets completed, you start development. Only when development completes, you do QA, right? Whereas in Agile, what it is saying is that no, that's not the scenario. What you're doing is, instead of taking this feature, what you're doing is you're breaking the feature down into sub features. Okay, sub feature one, sub feature two, let's say. Okay, just for sake of argument, now you've got sub feature one, sub feature two. Now in waterfall, what is happening is when the design team is taking or making the design, right, when this phase is going on, right, the dev and the QA are basically not working. They are basically waiting for the design team to finish their work, right? Once the design team hands over the work to the development team, then it's only the development team that is working. The QA team is basically just waiting for the development team to finish the work, right? Once it all comes down, then the QA is doing all the QA and then providing the feedback to the development team. Same way, when the development team is getting starting to work, then only they're going back to the design team and engaging them again. Now, the thing about this is it's again like not a very efficient way of, I would say, utilizing people, because um, while the design team is working, I can actually make the development team do some work on some other stuff as well, right? Which is exactly what Agile addresses. What it does is that it says that while the design team does, let's say, the sub feature one design, right? Obviously, the time taken to do this design will be much less. But what it essentially says is that you finish the design, like no one is working, that's fine, but I'm losing less number of days. But as soon as you finish, the development team starts working on sub feature one. In the meantime, the design team starts working on sub feature two, right? Then once the design team finishes this and the dev team finishes this, they move to sub feature two. In the meantime, QA starts working over here, right? Once the QA finishes the work over here, the dev team also finishes the work, and QA works. So basically, what happens is you're keeping each team engaged. You're giving the teams a lot more time in a way, but at the same time, their work is not reduced, right? They're still doing the same amount of work. The only difference is that they're doing the work in smaller chunks, right? And this is what is meant by an agile model, where you are making sure that these interactions are happening, right? So it's not only that when the dev team hands it over to the QA team is working in a silo. They're also going back to the dev team and asking questions, and that question is coming much faster, because over here, that since it's a sub feature, it's a assumed simpler implementation, right? So basically, what is happening is the QA team is getting a chance to talk to the dev team. The dev team is getting a chance to talk to the design team much faster, and at the end of it, there is a client, of course, and the client is also getting to talk to these people much faster, because there are sub features, and like it's breaking down the entire work into smaller chunks of features, right? And the same way, this is why I would say that T&M is much better, because it's not keeping anyone idle, first of all. At the same time, I would say also it works well for the milestone model, because the milestone model is again based on like what you define your milestone. So often in Waterfall, the milestones are basically the documents that are signed off. So it's a document based sign off over here. Again, as I said, the associated problem with the document sign off, in my experience, is when your client is not exactly um, at the same page with you are in terms of what you're using to implement the feature. Okay, if you're using an AI ML development circuit to build something, and if a client is not very aware of that particular technology, there could be an issue of getting sign-offs on documents. Instead, you show it on features, it becomes easier, right? So in Agile, of course, the milestones are based on features. So I would say, personally, I feel that feature-based milestones are much better than document-based milestones. All right. So on the billing aspect, again, I would say that Agile has, in my perspective, it's a much better way of billing. It makes billing easier. But also waterfall model has its own advantages. One of the advantages of billing in waterfall model is because you are kind of doing a sequential flow, right? So there is very less changes that is going to happen. What it does is that once the team gets to work, right? So the team has like a longer visibility in the sense, on a Monday, right? So the development team knows that the design is going on right now, but on Wednesday I will need to start working, right? So what happens is, in a lot of cases, if they're a development team of 4 people, what they do is that they can plan ahead, right? They can say that, okay, since Wednesday till next Tuesday, let's say, or Wednesday and Thursday, I'm going to just work on my development. Then, like, I can basically take my leaves on Monday, Tuesday, come back on Wednesday and start working. And when I'm working, I don't need to, like, have that kind of a tension in my head that, okay, something else might come in, some new review might come in and stuff, right? um, Agile, one of the problems of this, I would say, is that, since it's not very sequential and it doesn't tie down people saying that, okay, like, you have to work on this. What happens is sometimes, like, when you're working, right, and it's a real life problem, like some developer is working on some feature, right? And now in between there is a demo going on with the client on some other feature which they've already developed. And now the client comes back and says that this is not working. So basically what happens is the developer has probably done 60% of this work and is very invested in what he's doing right now. Now basically what happens is, since this demo is failing, or like the client doesn't like it, right? And then the team comes back and says, hey, like, drop off whatever you're doing on this and start working on this review that client is given, because it's a priority item, right? So basically the developer gets distracted. They don't get the time to finish off what they had done, right? And that could be a bit distracting. It could be counterproductive at times. But again, it depends on, how you want to scale or scale up and scale down the project. I would say Agile works much better for projects which has a lot of uncertainties, which has a lot of uh, things which are undecided yet, and you want to evolve as the project goes along. But if it's a mature client, if the client knows what they're doing, if the client is technical, if the client has got a good understanding of what the end result is going to be like, then waterfall is a better option, because it kind of keeps people much more organized and keeps them, like, focused on one singular piece of work for a longer duration. So just to summarize, because I know my scribbling board is like very untidy. So basically, waterfall and agile is like a document versus feature based model. uh, Agile is much easier to prioritize and replan. Agile helps you fail faster, but at the same time, waterfall model helps you focus and, complete larger chunks of work much better without distractions for the development team. And then again, the billing model for both these processes are a bit different and can be adjusted according to the requirements of the project. So I hope this helps you in your interviews. Thanks for watching. Have a good day.